Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time of day it might be for you as you are watching this. Thanks for tuning in to Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. In the New Testament, we are now up to the book of Philemon. Last week we looked at the book of Titus, and now we're looking at the book of Philemon. Philemon is an unusual book in many ways. In fact, it may be one of the most unusual books in the New Testament. And that's for a variety of reasons. One, it's a personal letter. This is the only letter we have from the Apostle Paul in which he sends the letter to one person rather than to a church. This may be because of the cost of letter writing. A recent estimate on the book of Romans indicates that it would have cost, to have the book of Romans written, it would have cost the equivalent of today $3,000 to $4,000. It was a very expensive thing. The quills had to be made, the inks had to be made, the parchment had to be made if it were written on parchment. It was a very, very expensive. Not only is the book personal, but it's also short. It's only 355 words in Greek. And so it's very unusual. It deals with a specific issue in a specific person's life. And so let's look together at what this book of Philemon actually has to say to us. Here's our inevitable cartoon, a bunch of lemons coming out of jail. They're excited. They've done their time. They're being set free, and they're going from bondage to brotherhood. And so there's a file of lemons, so you can remember Philemon is key word is really restitution or bondage to brotherhood. And it's written by someone who wants to be an intermediary. He wants to be a mediator between two different people, one who has wronged a person and the other person who is wrong. And so let's look together at what's going on here. Paul meets a runaway slave. It typically is the understanding of what has happened. And being a runaway slave in the first century was a very, very, very difficult thing, because the owner, no matter how kind he was, could not welcome you back without punishment, or all of his slaves would run away. And so Philemon is a book about that very issue of a runaway slave and of slavery. In terms of authorship, almost everyone accepts the fact that Paul was the author of this small letter. There are none of the issues that plague the pastoral epistles, and Timothy could have been acting sort of as a notary, saying, this letter really does come from Paul, and this indicates a serious topic, the fact that they would need a notary like that. The recipient is, of course, Philemon, after whom the book is named. Philemon's name occurs nowhere else in the New Testament, so we don't know much about him or who he was. From the book, we know that he was a person of means. He had his own house, and he had a guest room. Now that, today, doesn't seem like it would make much difference. It doesn't seem like it would indicate that you were a person of means just because you had a guest room. But in the first century, having a guest room was a luxury, which very, very few people had. Remember that there was virtually no middle class. There were rich people, and the majority of people were poor. Not only did he have a house, he, in verse 19, appears to have been converted through the ministry of Paul. And so he knew Paul already after Paul is writing this book to him. He ministered alongside Paul at some point. We don't know what that ministry was. We don't know exactly what he did, but we know that he did in one way or another minister alongside Paul. And we know that he was probably a leader of the church at his house, and that he had some of what he did was to encourage other believers. And we see that in verses 5 and 7. And so what we know about Philemon comes from this letter that Paul writes to him. And we know that he was a man who was wealthy enough to own slaves, and that he was a member of the Christian church and had money, at least enough money to make himself different from most of the people. When and where was the book of Philemon written? There is debate about where Paul was imprisoned at the time that this was written. I won't get into the minutiae here, but I will say that Christian tradition almost uniformly says that Paul was imprisoned in Rome, and that the letter, both Philemon and the letter to the Colossians, was written from Rome. And this would date the letter writing around 60 to 63, somewhere around in there, for the writing of the letter. The letter is so carefully written that almost every sentence hints at more than it says. And so when we read it, we have to read it very carefully. You could sit down and read the book of Philemon in 10 minutes, easily. And yet, if you just read through it as quickly as you could and didn't think about what was being said, you would miss a lot of the implications that Paul has. Let's look at the historical situation that we see behind the book of Philemon. Onesimus was a runaway slave, and Philemon was apparently his master. Now, I'll stop for a second and say there are a few who will argue that Philemon was actually the runaway slave. I don't think that works, and I think it has to make the text do gyration. So Philemon was the slave owner, I believe. And so here in verse 18, of course, Philemon only has one chapter, so we can just go by the verse. In verse 18, Paul says about Onesimus, "Now if he has defrauded you of anything he owes you, or anything, charge what he owes to me." The apostle is saying, I'll take care of it. If he's run away, if he's stolen from you, whatever has happened, I'll take care of it. In Greek grammar, this particular text, verse 18, indicates that there's no question, there's no if about it. If sometimes occur in Greek grammar, and it could just as easily be translated since. So Paul says, since he has defrauded you of something, or he owes you something, charge whatever he owes to me. Paul is simply saying, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of it, Philemon. If you trust me and you know me, I'll take care of it. There are other things inside this historical situation. One of the most important ones is that Onesimus, the slave, had become a Christian, probably under the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And so, in verse 10, Paul says this, "I am appealing to you concerning my child, whose spiritual father I have become during my imprisonment." That is Onesimus. He's saying to us that Onesimus, who once was a slave, has now become a Christian. And that makes a huge difference in the way that Philemon will treat him and in the kind of actions that Philemon will take against him. Thus, Onesimus and Philemon were now brothers in Christ. And treating your brother one way and someone who's not your brother is another way is exactly what we would expect. Verse 16, Paul says that he wants Philemon to treat Onesimus no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a dear brother. Onesimus, this has changed the relationship between Onesimus and Philemon. Onesimus had at one time been useless to his master, and now Paul says he is useful to your master, and he he uses wordplay. Paul uses wordplay to point this out. Here you will see the two different words that Paul uses. Archaerestos, which means useless, without a use. Charestos means useful, and put an alpha on the front of it. It means useless, having no use. But then in the next phrase where Paul says he once was useless, but now he is useful, Paul uses the term eucharistos. And you can see that there's a play on words just from the sound of them. He used to be unuseful or useless, but now he is very useful. And so let's realize Paul is making a huge point here. He's saying to those around him, listen, I know that he's a runaway slave. I know that he's done things that he shouldn't have. I know that he's not the kind of person that you would normally just welcome back. But he's changed now. He's a Christian. The major theme of the book, of course, is slavery. And so there are a lot of important things to think about in terms of slavery today. Paul sends Onesimus back with this letter, and almost every verse hints at something more than it states. Slavery was very, very important to the economic well-being of the Roman Empire. The incredible results of the revolt of Spartacus. You have seen the movie if you haven't read about the revolt. And the revolt happened in 73 to 71 BC, so it had happened before. It was fresh in the minds of those that were around. And this shows that the proposal of the abolition of slavery would have had empire-shaking potential. And so let's look at some important things about slavery, because this always becomes a stumbling block, at least for some. First, how did one become a slave in the first century? There were at least 4 ways that one became a slave. One was by being captured at war. If you were a prisoner of war, you often were sold off and you were then treated as if you were a piece of property. Secondly, you could become a slave by being captured by slave hunters. Paul does speak against this in 1 Timothy, where he lays out a variety of commands, and one of them that he commands that no one should do is man-stealer. It's another word for slave hunter, people who went off, kidnapped other people, dragged them back, and turned them into slaves. So, first, you could be a slave by being captured, a prisoner of war. Secondly, you could be a slave by being stolen. Thirdly, you could be a slave by selling yourself as a result of debt. Some people got into such debt that they couldn't pay it. They would sell themselves into slavery. The slave owner would pay off their debt, and they would then be a slave to that slave owner for the rest of their life. And then the fourth way, in addition to prisoner of war, being stolen, selling oneself, the fourth way that one could become a slave is by being born to a slave mother. So those are the basic 4 ways that one became a slave in the first century. What you should notice is, and what is significantly very important, is that there's nothing that mentions race. None of the slavery of the first century was race-based or race-related. And that is why the slavery of the first century differs from the slavery of the United States that was in force until Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. There's a very, very large difference between slavery in the New Testament and slavery in the United States. It's very important that we understand that, because if we don't, we are liable to import a bunch of bad things that we think about slavery into the book of Philemon when they really don't fit there. But there's a second kind of question that we can ask about slavery, and that is, what did a slave do? There were a variety of different kinds of things that a slave would do during the first century. Some, and many of them, did heavy labor. They might work in the mines. They might row ships or something like that. If you didn't have to do that kind of heavy manual labor, some worked in households. And so they were a manual servant in a household. In this case, they wouldn't have been that bad off. They would have been not much worse off than an 18th century servant. They would still be owned by someone, which is a terrible thing, but it wasn't as bad as working in the mines. And then a few, and there aren't many of these, but a few of slaves who were very well educated would sometimes be an administrator for their master's business, or they would be an educator for their master's child, or they would even sometimes, believe it or not, sometimes they would earn their own money, and sometimes they would save up their money and pay their master by themselves out of slavery. So the kind of jobs that a slave had were different from many of the slaves of the United States. And I don't want to say anything more about that, the difference in slavery, but it's important that you recognize that the slavery that we think about whenever slavery comes to our mind is different from the slavery of the first century. And the first question that comes to mind whenever we start talking about slavery like this is, why didn't Paul speak out against slavery? Why didn't he just say, hey, slavery is wrong, every Christian master ought to let his slaves go? Well, there are a variety of reasons for this. One question is verse 21, where Paul says, treat him as you would treat me, and I know that you will do more than this. Paul is saying, if you'll do more than this, that is, you will set him free. So it may be that Paul is saying, sort of hinting at setting him free. And so Paul, he asks the slave owner to defy the current conventions by not punishing Onesimus. And that's very significant, because not punishing a runaway slave, as I've already mentioned, was critical. Anyone who didn't punish a runaway slave was essentially saying to the rest of those slaves that were in his house, you can run away too and you won't get punished. But some see Philemon as the Apostle Paul sort of representing a lack of nerve. They say, well, yeah, Paul hinted at getting rid of slavery, but he didn't tell Philemon that keeping another human being as a slave is wrong. Why is that? And without going into a great deal of time here on that issue, I will point you to a book, the book Philemon, written by Scott McKnight. It's a commentary on the book of Philemon, and in the introduction, he goes into a great deal of trouble to argue about why Paul did what he did about slavery in the book of Philemon. It's a very good book. I think you'll very much enjoy reading it. So that's apparently why Paul doesn't speak out against slavery. Verse 21, Paul says, Philemon will do more than asked. So Paul is saying to Philemon, I know that you'll do more than asked. Paul does challenge the slave owner to defy those conventions of punishing a slave. And even though some see Philemon as Paul lacking nerve, it's not really the case, and you can read Scott McKnight to learn more about that if you'd like to. What happened to Onesimus the slave? We don't know for certain, but there are some interesting questions. One is, why was the letter preserved? Presumably, Paul wrote other personal letters that were not saved for us. There are at least 2 letters that he wrote to the Corinthians, you remember back from when we talked about the Corinthian correspondence, that we don't have today. And so not every personal letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, and not every personal letter that he had was saved for us. There is a proposal by a person named John Knox. It's not the John Knox after whom Knox Seminary was named, but a modern theologian with the same name. And this is what Knox proposes. He said that Philemon released Onesimus and that he returned to work with Paul in Ephesus. Paul needed help, and Philemon gives him, he frees Onesimus, and Onesimus goes back to work with Paul as a Christian figure. And he stays there once Paul had left. He was there more than 50 years later, this is Knox's proposal, when Ignatius of Antioch addresses the Ephesian church. Ignatius of Antioch is a very early church father, not long after the New Testament. And so, it's held by Knox that Onesimus was charged with collecting Paul's letters. What Ignatius says is, the person of Onesimus, a man of love beyond recounting, and your bishop. So this may not have been the same Onesimus, but if it was, it's amazing that the once slave now became a bishop. And since he was charged with collecting Paul's letters, Paul was now long dead after that time, with pride, Onesimus included a small, little, tiny, personal letter that he had treasured all these years. And he had treasured this small, personal letter because it had made him a slave of a different person. He went from being a slave of Philemon to being a slave of Jesus Christ. We don't know if that's true or not, but Raymond Brown, the great Roman Catholic scholar, says if it's not true, it ought to be. Well, we don't know, but we certainly know that Onesimus did something as his life was changed by this letter. The question is why this letter was proposed. Does it have any theological implications for us? Does it really say anything that makes any difference? Could you preach from the letter? It's interesting. I have a piece of software with thousands of sermons on it. And I only found a couple of sermons on Philemon. One by the early church father Chrysostom, a couple by Spurgeon, and nobody that I could find in modern times. That doesn't mean they didn't preach on it, it just means I don't have a copy of it there. But it's very interesting. There's not a lot of preaching on the book of Philemon. Part of that is because it's short, but part of that is because people wonder, I don't know what kind of theology it has. So let me give you a couple of ideas about what kind of theology the book of Philemon has. One, it has the theology of imputation. Remember that Paul says, if he has defrauded you of anything or owes you anything, charge what he owes to me. The King James says, charge that to my account. Remember that there are three great imputations in biblical theology. There's the imputation of sin to Adam. There's the imputation of Adam's sin to us. And there's the imputation of our sin to Christ. And when sin is imputed to Christ, that means he takes away our sin, whatever we've done wrong, he takes it away. Sometimes people say that justification means just as if I'd never sinned, but it's more than that. It's not just as if you'd never sinned. It's more than that. It's just as if you had done every righteous thing that Christ had done. He imputes his righteousness to us. So we are imputed Adam's sin. Our sin is imputed to Christ, and then Christ's righteousness is imputed to us. And we then stand before God, not with our own sin, not even morally neutral, but we stand before God having had God's righteousness in Jesus Christ imputed to us. So when we stand before God, he sees us as if we had done every great thing that Jesus Christ himself had done. That's one of the great themes of the book, that theme of imputation. Paul says, charge that to my account. And Jesus says about us, charge all of their sins to my account. But there's a second thing, and that is providence. Paul says, for perhaps it was for this reason that he was separated from you for a little while, so that you might have him back eternally. Notice that Paul says perhaps here. He doesn't know for certain about the providence of God. He can't say for certain that that's the reason that he was separated. He can only say perhaps. And we ought to be very, very careful. If the Apostle Paul can't be certain about God's providence, neither should we be. We don't know why God sends storms or accidents or fires or any of those kinds of things. And we should be very careful in our attribution of sin to the cause of some kind of natural evil. You remember when Katrina hit, there were a variety of people who argued, well, New Orleans is one of the wickedest cities, therefore that's why God did that. We don't know. We have no way of knowing that, and we ought not to say it. Because if the apostle can't be sure about the providence of God, then neither can we be sure about the providence of God. Why would one want to be a slave? Because that's the way that the New Testament authors, at least 4 of the New Testament authors, begin their epistles. They begin their epistles by describing themselves as a doulos, a slave of Christ or God. Peter begins 2 Peter that way by saying a slave of Christ. Paul begins Romans that way and Philemon that way by saying that he is a slave of Christ, and Titus that way by saying he's a slave of Christ. James begins the book of James that way by saying that he is a slave of Christ, and Jude begins the book of Jude that way by saying that he is a slave of Christ. And so all of us ought to realize that there's something different about being a slave of Christ than being a slave to another man. And the determining factor of this slavery is whom you belong to, or to whom you belong. If you belong to the most perfect, kind, gentle master in the world, then slavery is a privilege. It is a privilege to be a slave of Christ. It is not a privilege to be a slave of another person, to be treated like an object. Christ treats us not like an object, but like his beloved. And that's why it is a great privilege to be his slave. That's the privilege of slavery. We have here the testimony of James, Jude, Paul. Interesting, though, James and Jude were apparently written by 2 brothers of Jesus. And yet they begin the book not by saying that they were Jesus' brother. They don't say, listen, you've got to pay attention to us because we're the brother of Jesus. No. They begin the book by saying, slave of Christ. For example, Jude says, Jude, a slave of Jesus Christ and a brother of James. Not a brother of Jesus and also his slave. And so we can infer, perhaps, that it is a greater privilege to be a slave of Jesus Christ than it is even to be his earthly brother. So I speak to all of you today who are lovers of Jesus Christ with the realization that you have a great and wonderful privilege to be slaves of the greatest master ever. I hope that you will read the book of Philemon. And you will think about what we've said today. It's a very fast read. It will have a lot of interesting things to say to you and a great blessing to you. Next week, we'll be moving on into what are called the Catholic epistles. I'll tell you why they're called the Catholic epistles next week, but we will be looking at the book of Hebrews, and I hope that you'll be with me. Thanks for watching Coral Ridge Presbyterian Sunday School, and I hope that this has been a real blessing to you. Go and be blessed, people of Jesus Christ. Thank you.